Long before Europe had a word for it, sailors on the other side of the world were already covering their bodies in ink before setting out across open ocean. And the marks they chose were never random. Somewhere in that old practice lies a specific answer to a question most people never think to ask: why anyone would make their skin permanent at the exact moment their future became so uncertain. The clearest roots of this custom lie in the Pacific, among the seafaring cultures of Polynesia, where tattooing had already been practiced for well over 2,000 years before European ships ever appeared on the horizon. Long voyages across the Pacific were not casual undertakings. They required deep, inherited knowledge of stars, currents, wave patterns, and wind, passed down through generations of navigators who could read the ocean the way a modern sailor reads a chart. Tattooing was closely bound up with this world. Skilled specialists, known in several island cultures as tufuga tatatao, used tools carved from bone, shell, or wood to tap pigment beneath the skin in sessions that could stretch across weeks. In Maori tamoko, specialists traditionally used uhi, chisels often made from seabird bone, while pigments were commonly prepared from charcoal mixed with plant-derived oils or liquids. The process itself was considered sacred rather than decorative, and in Maori tradition specifically, the practitioners who performed it were regarded as tapu, a word meaning sacred or set apart, later borrowed into English as taboo. What these tattoos communicated went far beyond simple ornament. Historians studying Polynesian tattoo traditions describe them as something closer to a visible record of a person's life, marking lineage, social rank, personal achievement, and stages of maturity. A pattern was not chosen for how it looked, but for what it proved about the person wearing it. Before undertaking a long and dangerous voyage, receiving new tattoo work could mark a person's readiness, their status, or their connection to ancestors whose protection they hoped to carry with them across open water. Given how dangerous long ocean voyages were, it is easy to understand why a permanent mark, applied through a painful and sacred process, felt appropriate before facing that uncertainty. For centuries, this tradition remained almost entirely unknown outside the Pacific. That changed abruptly in 1769, when the British explorer James Cook and his crew, aboard the ship Endeavour, arrived in Tahiti. Joseph Banks, the naturalist traveling with Cook, wrote one of the first detailed European accounts of the practice, describing in his journal how Tahitians marked their bodies indelibly. Cook recorded the local word for the process, which he spelled tato, an attempt to capture the sound of tatau, a term some scholars believe is onomatopoeic, echoing both the tap of the tattooing tool and the sharp intake of breath from the person receiving it. Within a few years, that word had entered the English language permanently, and it remains, essentially unchanged, the word used worldwide today. What happened next reshaped the meaning of tattooing entirely. Sailors serving under Cook, having witnessed and in many cases received Tahitian tattoo work themselves, carried the practice home to Europe, where it took on a very different character. European sailors were not part of a culture where tattooing held ancient, sacred structure. Instead, over the following century, an entirely new set of maritime symbols and superstitions developed, largely among Western naval and merchant crews, each mark carrying its own practical or protective meaning. A swallow tattooed on the chest was believed to represent distance traveled, since the bird was known for always finding its way home, no matter how far it flew. An anchor signaled that a sailor had crossed the Atlantic. A fully rigged ship marked the far more dangerous achievement of rounding Cape Horn, one of the most treacherous stretches of water in the world. Some sailors tattooed a small pig on one foot and a rooster on the other, drawn from a grim but oddly comforting observation that wooden crates carrying live pigs and chickens were sometimes the only cargo to survive a shipwreck, floating ashore intact while heavier goods sank. Wearing the same animals on their own skin was thought, in a distinctly informal kind of folk belief, to offer some of that same luck. Other recorded sailor traditions included a dragon for service on a China station, a shellback turtle for crossing the equator, and the words "hold fast" across the knuckles as a charm for maintaining a grip on the rigging. Religious imagery served a more specific and, in some accounts, remarkably practical purpose. Sailors sometimes tattooed a crucifix or other religious symbol across their back, based on a widely repeated belief among crews that a captain would hesitate before ordering a flogging across an image of the crucifixion. Whether this belief consistently changed a captain's behavior is difficult to confirm today, but it reveals how seriously sailors took these marks as genuine protection, not simple decoration. There was also a far more sober, practical reason tattoos became common at sea, one with little to do with luck or symbolism at all. Long voyages carried real risk of death, and bodies lost overboard or recovered after a wreck were often unrecognizable. A distinctive, permanent tattoo could serve as a means of identification when little else remained to confirm who a sailor had been. In an era with no photographs carried in wallets and no formal identification documents as we understand them today, a tattoo was sometimes the only lasting physical record of a person's identity, deliberately placed on the body before departure specifically because it might need to answer a question the sailor themselves would not be alive to answer. This identifying function also entered official records. 18th and 19th century American seamen's protection certificates and naval descriptions sometimes recorded initials, scars, and tattoos as distinguishing physical features. Over time, as travel grew safer and formal identification more standardized, most of the original, practical reasons for a sailor to be tattooed quietly disappeared. Ships no longer vanish without any trace nearly as often. Sailors are no longer identified primarily through the markings on their own skin. What has remained, carried forward long after its original urgency faded, is the aesthetic itself, the swallow, the anchor, the nautical star, patterns that continue to appear in tattoo studios today, chosen now far more often for how they look than for what they were once meant to prove or protect against. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, tattooing had also become fashionable among some European aristocrats and members of royal families, showing that it was never confined entirely to sailors or the working classes. What this history ultimately reveals is how a single, permanent mark on the body can serve an entirely different purpose, depending on who is wearing it and why. For a Polynesian navigator preparing for a voyage across thousands of miles of open Pacific, a tattoo recorded identity, achievement, and inherited knowledge passed down through generations. For a European sailor, centuries later, the same basic act of marking the skin became a hedge against bad luck, a quiet act of religious protection, or a grim insurance policy against being lost at sea without a name. The methods, meanings, and cultures could hardly have been more different. Yet, in both cases, people facing the same enormous uncertainty, an ocean with no guarantee of return, reached for the exact same solution, something permanent enough to survive the journey, even if they themselves did not.